Today we are building this Tic Tac Toe game from scratch. We are gonna be deploying it for free on Netlify, and we are not gonna need any frameworks for this beginner-friendly game. To get started playing, we click the Start Game button here. We give each player a name, we press Start, and we see that their names have been updated. Each player has their own icon and also their score. As soon as one player wins, their score is updated. Then the game resets and we always see whose turn it is. If the game turned out to be a tie, like so, we see that it's a tie and the game also resets. If we would like to restart the game, we click the Restart Game button, we can give our players a new name and we see that the whole playing field has been reset. In addition to that, we will be doing all the styling from scratch, which is also, of course, fully mobile responsive, and it looks good on any device. To get started, make sure you have a GitHub account by clicking the sign up on github.com. We're gonna need this account to deploy our project later. You're gonna enter an email and create a password. Once you have a GitHub account, download GitHub Desktop for your computer. We're also gonna use this to deploy later on. Once you have downloaded GitHub Desktop, install it and open it up and log in with your GitHub account. It's gonna look a bit like this. We are gonna create our repository for our project by going to File and clicking New Repository. We're gonna give it a name, Tic Tac Toe. You can call it whatever you want. Game. We're gonna create repository and we're gonna publish repository. We're gonna keep this code private or public as we want. I'm gonna put this one public so you can also access this code in the description of this video. If you don't have Visual Studio Code, I would suggest downloading it. That's what we're going to be using to write our code. You can download it on code.visualstudio.com. Once you have Visual Studio, you can open it here, and that is going to open our project like this. You can ignore this welcome message. We're going to close that. We're going to delete this git attributes file, and then you're going to go in the description of this video and you're going to click the link to the GitHub repository. It's going to look a bit like this. And you're gonna go to the code button here in green. You're gonna download the zip. You're gonna find your download and you're gonna extract all. You're gonna go into the folder. You're gonna find the asset folder. And then we're gonna drag the asset folder into our repository inside of VS Code. You can simply copy the folder if you're getting asked. And as we can see inside the asset folder, we have two PNGs, one circle and one cross. Next thing, we're gonna install our extensions. So the extensions you're gonna need for this project is Live Server by Ritwik Day. So you just search Live Server here if you don't already have it installed. It's gonna most likely be the first one you find. It has 34 million installs, as you can see here. So here it says, where it says uninstall for me, it's gonna say install for you. This is essential for certain JavaScript functions to work. The next extension we're gonna use is Prettier Code Formatter. So if you just search Prettier, same thing, it should be the first one showing up. It has 32 million downloads, and install this as well. This is gonna help us keep our code clean, and it's also gonna make your code look similar to mine by formatting things like spacing within our code, and it's gonna be easier for you to follow along. Now that we have that set up, we're gonna start creating our files. It's a pretty easy project. We only have 3 files here. We're gonna start with our index.html file, and then we're gonna create our style.css, and then our script.js file. So one file for each thing. In our index file, we're gonna hold Shift 1 to get our suggested exclamation mark. We're gonna click that, which gives us a boilerplate HTML code to start with. We're gonna give this a title, call it Tic Tac Toe. Feel free to get creative here. And then we are gonna, over our title, we're gonna link to our script. We're gonna give it a source of script that we find already here. And then under that, we're gonna link. We're gonna go to CSS and we're gonna link to our style sheet, and it already has figured out where we want to link to. We're gonna hit Control S, save that. Then we're gonna go into our style sheet. We're gonna write body, and we're gonna say background blue. Hit save. We're gonna go into our script file. We are gonna say console log. Let's say, very creative, test. And we're gonna save that. And now the beauty of live server is gonna show itself. Down in the bottom right corner, we're gonna say go live. I'm gonna click that. And that's gonna start our website as if it was deployed on a web page. It started here. There we go. I'm gonna close this download. I'm gonna close the asset folder. I'm gonna keep the finished project so we can see for reference. And here is our new project that we are currently making. As we see, the style sheet has been correctly linked into the HTML file, because the background is blue. If we inspect here and we go to the console section, we see that we have written something wrong. Perfect. Let's see. Yes, this was not supposed to be curly braces, but just normal. There we go. Now that should be working. Yeah, so text has been successfully logged into the console from our first line on the script.js file. So we see that both the style sheet and the JavaScript file works. Let's make it a bit easier to see both of our files at the same time. I'm going to close the console. I'm going to make our VS Code a bit bigger. I'm also going to close this Explorer because we have all the files we need up here. Back in our HTML file, we are going to start with the fun stuff. We're going to write in our body, we're going to create a grid for the playing field for this grid right here. As we can see here on the mobile section, it's a bit more clear. This grid is its own div, so we're going to start with that. Using Emmet Abbreviation, as you can see here, by starting with a dot or a hashtag. So if you want to create a class, you can say dot and then class name, hit enter, and that's going to create a div with a class. If you want to create an ID instead, then you start with a hashtag and you say ID name. This is just a name example, and you hit enter, and that's going to create an ID instead. Pretty useful shortcut. So we're going to delete that, and we're going to create an ID with the name of grid, hit enter, and inside of that grid, we're going to create our squares. We're going to create each individual square. We're going to write hashtag grid underscore square -1, and then we're gonna hit dot because you can combine ID and classes at the same time in Emmet Abbreviation. So here we're gonna create a class. We're gonna call it grid underscore square, hit enter, and we see our div and class has been created. I'm gonna save that. Nothing is showing up on our left because we haven't yet created or given the grid and the square inside any styling or height whatsoever. If you're wondering why I'm naming these divs the way I am, it might look a bit complicated and unnecessary. It's called BEM or BEM naming convention, and it's a way to keep track of our CSS styling properties. It's quite simple. When you have one outer div, one outer element, and you call that, for example, grid, this div is the child of grid, and it has the name of square1. And we know that by the separating double underline here. And then for the class, it's the same, grid square. This one has an ID of square1 because we're going to create several IDs, and each of them has to have a unique ID. That's what IDs are for. An ID should only exist one instance. But we're using the class of grid square to give all of them similar properties in our style sheet, whilst we use the IDs to target them for our JavaScript code. So let's continue copying these 9 times, and we're going to just change the code for the ID to be unique, 1 through 8 and 9. We're going to save that, and the classes are the same. If we inspect our site here, we should be able to see our grid. It's showing up. Okay. In our style sheet, let's give our grid, let's target it. Let's give it a display of grid first, because so far it's only a random div. Then we're going to give it a grid template column of repeat, and then we're going to write 3 columns, each has 1 fraction of the size. Let's give it a height of 400 pixels and a width of 400 pixels. And now when we hover over the div, we see that our grid has been created. So we have 3 by 3 grid, each taking 1 fraction, which this means, of the available space. Let's also give it a grid gap of 0.4 rem, and that's going to create, as we see here, the purple-ish gaps between each square in the grid. And if you're not familiar with rem, a simple conversion is that 1 or 16 pixels equals 1 rem. And the reason for using rem is primarily because it is more versatile regarding each device and each person's preferences. So some people might have a preference to show text on their browser as larger, and then rem is going to scale to that. Compared to if you use hard-coded pixels, it's going to stay hard-coded as pixels, disregarding whatever the user wants and has set as their preferences in their browser. So a good site I use to convert between pixels and rem is a website called nicocalc.com, pixels to rem converter. And here you can write in, we're going to convert our 400 pixels to 25 rem, as we can see here. But if we wanted, let's say, 20 rem into pixels, we see that it goes both ways. So 25. Okay, close that, put it back there. So 25 rem and 25 rem. I'm gonna take away this comment here. And then we are gonna give a background color to our grid. Let's just give it white for now. We're gonna give it a padding of 0.4 rem. We're gonna give it also a border radius to smoothen out the edges a bit of 0.5 rem. As we can see here, it gives it a bit more of a modern look. Then we are going to target our grid __ square. That's every square, where we're gonna give them a border radius as well. Actually, let's give them a color first. Background of red, just so we can see them. We're going to change these to a bit more nicer colors later. Then we're going to give them a border radius of 0.3 rem, also to smoothen them out a bit. And then we're going to give them a border of, and this is where it gets interesting, we're going to give them a variable, which is possible inside of CSS. And we're going to call this variable border. We haven't created this variable yet, but we are calling it here. And that's going to be inside of this variable. It's going to be saved the color that we want for the border around the squares, and we're going to be reusing it in a couple of places. In fact, we're going to change this red and we're going to change this blue to use variables as well. So before we continue, let's create our global variables. I'm going to create a comment here to create a bit of structure. So we're going to call it general. And here we're going to target our root, that is our whole website. And then we are going to create our variables by writing --. We're going to give them a name, bg green, that's going to be our background that is blue currently. And then we're going to give them the color. So this could be, let's say, yellow. I could just write here. And then I could call it here. Instead of the background hard-coded as blue, I could call it with the variable and then two parentheses. And then I could say BG, and it's already suggested here, green. It's a bit confusing. I call it BG green because it's going to be green, but I put it as yellow. Let's just change that so it's not as confusing. And we see that when I change the variable, light green, let's say, does that exist? Green, it does. Then we see that it automatically updates all the properties that are using the variable BG green. So that's the very useful thing about using variables for especially colors, because then when you're tweaking your colors later on, you don't have to change it every single place that you have used that color. You can change it in one place and that automatically updates your style sheet. So it's a very useful habit to get into, to use CSS variables. Now let's update this variable to the actual one. We're going to use a linear gradient, because we see in this finished one, on the left side it's darker and on the right side it is lighter. So we're going to create that using the linear gradient keyword. Then we're going to give that a parentheses. We're going to write 19 degrees, comma, RGBA, parentheses, 4, 57, 46, 1, and then outside of that parentheses, 0%. So at 0% from the left, that's going to be the color, which is a dark green. And then comma, RGBA, parentheses, 0, 1, 5, 3, 1, 0, 2, 1, and then outside of the parentheses, 100%. So at 100%, which is the complete right, it's going to be this color. So let's see if we wrote that correctly. Control S, save. And then if you didn't format that correctly, usually Prettier here is going to not show a check mark. And that's going to give you a little clue as to there might be some formatting issue. But now we see that there is none. So we see also that the color has been successfully added. While we are here, we're going to create the other color gradients that we're going to be using in the project. So we're going to call the next one BG red. We are going to just copy this first one because it's a lot to type, and we're simply going to change that. Save. It's going to also be 90 degrees, but instead in here, it's going to be 39, 0, 0. Here we are also going to use RGB and not RGBA, which means we're using 3 numbers. In the second one, we're going to use 149, 0, and 0. I'm going to save that. Let's target it here in our grid square to test it. Don't forget the semicolon. And we see that this gradient also works. It's not going to be used for the boxes. It's going to be used for the modal here that we have when we open our player name option. We are going to copy the BG green again. Go down to a new line. It's going to be called BG brown. It's going to be 90 degrees, a linear gradient, and these numbers we're going to change to 99, 61, 0, and 1. And the next 4 we're going to change to 149, 93, 0, and 1. Hit save. Let's change the grid square to BG brown to test. It also works. Perfect. Next variable we are creating is BG white, and we're just going to call it white. We're going to create our next variable, call it background, modal, and we are going to give this hashtag 0E11 0EAF. We're going to save that. That is going to be the dark shade here that is behind the modal, kind of giving a shadow on every element behind it. Next variable is going to be text white, and we are going to just give it the color of white. Next one is going to be text dark, and we are going to give this an RGB value, not RGBA, of 54, 54, 54. Save that. Next variable, text light, and this one is going to be hashtag C7, C7, C7. Next one, text gold, which is going to be our title for Tic Tac Toe, 255, 217, 17, yes, and 0. And then we're going to have a dark variable. It's going to have 080808. And then our last variable, I know it's a handful, but we are going to be saving us a lot of time to use these and not be repeating and choosing colors for every single element. Here we're going to write border 0.1 rem solid, because we want a solid line, and then RGB 224, 224, and 224. And that is all the variables we are going to be using in this project. Now let's move back to our body, because this grid is not very well positioned. So we are going to give this body a display of flex. Then we are going to give it a flex wrap of wrap, because later on we're going to have several elements and we want them to wrap like they are doing now. One goes under the other when they are in mobile view, and then when they're not, they go next to each other, because they're going to be wrapped when they don't have enough space to be next to each other. You see, when I hover over the body here, that purple space is leftover space. And as soon as I shrink the screen size here, below that leftover space, one element, and that's going to be the last one, is going to go under the other two, because it's going to be wrapped. So that's what that styling property does. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to align our items to the center. Oops, let's go back to our project. To the center, that's going to align them. I see now that we haven't given our body a height, which is why it is not doing anything. We're going to give it a height of 100 view height. So however large the view screen is, that's how high the body is going to be. And now when I saved, you see that it has positioned through align items to the center. We are getting a scrolling bar here, which we are going to be removing by saying margin 0, because the body element has a margin of a couple of pixels, 2 pixels I believe, by default. Let's actually see how many pixels. 8 pixels. Okay. Next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to justify our content, and we're going to space them evenly. We see now that it has been, if I comment out this, it's being spaced evenly. Now it's just sitting on the left side. But now when we add this justify content space evenly, all the elements, and even if it's 1 or 3 or 300, they're going to be spaced evenly within the border. Last thing we're going to add is we're going to add our font family. For now, I'm just going to set it to Times New Roman, but we are going to import a custom font from Google Fonts. So in our browser, we're going to go to fonts.google.com. We're going to search for Poppins. One shows up. We're going to click that. And then we're going to scroll down. We're going to target Thin 100. We're going to target light. We're basically going to target everything that is not italic. 300, 400, 500, 600, 7, 8, and 9. And then we're going to click this top right here, view selected families. We see that we have all of them targeted here. And then we're going to scroll down. We're going to click this import here. We're going to copy that code. Then we're going to go back to our code here in the top. We're going to paste that. We're going to remove these style tags here. We're going to save. And then we're going to open up our browser again. And then we're going to copy this CSS rule. Open up our code again. And then we're just going to paste that in here instead of the font family we have. And there we go. We don't have any text yet, but that's going to be in the Poppins family now. The next thing we're going to do, let's give this a comment as well, grid. You can comment easily by first writing whatever you want to write and then hitting Shift KC. Control KC. And if you want to uncomment it, Control KU. That's a little hack for you. Under body, we are gonna target our H1. Actually, let's go into our HTML file. Let's just write an H1 here. Hello, so that we can see it. That way it's gonna be easier to see what we are doing. We're gonna target our H1. We're gonna give it a property of margin 0. And then we are gonna give it a font size of 1 rem, which is gonna decrease it a bit. So let's copy this H1 code. Hold Shift, Alt, and down, and you can copy the code you want. Alternatively, you can also hold Alt and press down to move whatever code you want. But we're gonna copy it now. Shift, Alt, down. We're gonna say H1 colon hover, and then we're gonna say comma H2 colon hover, and then we're gonna say that when we hover over these, as you can see with the H1, our cursor changes to this kind of text cursor, and we don't want that to happen. It's a game. We don't really want any emphasis to be put on the text, so I want to remove that. And we do that by saying when we hover over H1 or H2 text, we're going to give it a cursor of default. And let's see, when I hover over, it doesn't change now. Perfect. We are done with our general styling. Let's get back to our grid. Now that we have our variables, we can actually give our grid the proper background it's supposed to have. So we're going to call it variable, and we're going to choose the variable bg for background brown. Looks correct. And then we're going to change the grid square background as well to be the bg white background. Now it's starting to look a bit more similar to the finished project. The next thing we're going to target is our grid square and then hover. So similar to the H1 and H2, whenever we hover over here, I want it to be looking like we can click it, and therefore we are going to say whenever we hover over it, we're going to have a cursor of pointer and save that. And now we see it gives more of the feeling that we can actually click this. Of course, nothing happens when we click here now because there is no functionality yet. But that is all for the grid styling. Next thing, let's add our player scores here. You can see here, we're going to add our title and each player's name, icon, and score. Back in our index.html file, let's remove our h1 hello here. Then we are going to create a new div above our grid. We are gonna say hashtag, and we're gonna call it info. I'm gonna press enter. And inside of this div, we're going to create an h2. We are going to give it an ID of info underscore underscore title, because this title ID is inside of info, if you remember that. Then actually inside of here, we're going to write tic tac toe. We're going to save like so. And we see that our text is showing here. Then under the h2, we're going to create a div with the class of info underscore underscore player. And then inside of that div, we are going to create an image. We are going to give it a source of assets. So we can go into our assets folder and then slash, and then we are going to give the first player the cross PNG showing up here. Good. This is going to have an alt text of player1 icon. And it's also going to have a class of info underscore underscore player underscore underscore icon. There we go. And now let's copy paste this div by holding Shift, Alt, and down arrow. We're going to keep the class the same. We are going to just change the cross to circle and hit save. And we're going to say alt text player2 icon, and class is the same. Then under the first image, we are going to give it an h1. We are going to give this an ID of info underscore underscore player underscore underscore name1. And then inside of that h1, we're going to just write player1. That's going to be our default starting point. And then we're going to copy paste this h1 twice. In the second one, we don't need an ID. Just remove that, and we're going to just have a colon here. And then we are going to give the third h1 an ID instead of name. We're going to say score1. We are going to be targeting these later in our JavaScript. And inside here, the default score is going to be set to 0. There we go. Let's copy these h1s under our second image and just change the values to name2, player2, and score2. Now we have all our elements. I also see here that in our head here, where we have linked to our script, JavaScript file, we forgot to add the attribute defer, because that is going to help our JavaScript run correctly. It is basically going to load the entire HTML body element, the entire HTML code. It's going to load before the JavaScript. Whilst if we had not included this defer, it would try to run JavaScript code that references HTML elements that don't exist yet. Now we have everything we need in the info section. We can go back to our style sheet and we can go under the body here. We are going to write a new comment. We're going to call that info, and we are going to target the info ID here. We're going to say we want to text align this to the center. Then we want to give it a width of 15 rem. Then we want to give it a color of variable text gold. And next up, we want to target info title. And we want to give it a font size of 2 rem. Make it a bit bigger. Then we want to target info player. And we want to display it as a flex. And then we want to justify the content with space between. and we want to give it a margin of 0 and a padding of 0.5 rem, a border radius of 0.3 rem, and a border of variable. And now is where all these variables come in handy. We're going to choose the border variable. And then we're going to choose the color variable. Let's see, dark. And background variable bg white. Starting to get there. The icons are still very big. We are gonna target them next by going into info __ player __ icon, and we're gonna give them a height of 20 pixels. Here we're using pixels. Let's convert that right away. We're gonna give it a height of 1.3 rem. We are gonna give it a padding top of 0.13 rem, or 2 pixels. I see here that we don't have any space here, and that is because it's not supposed to be 0 margin, it's supposed to be 1 rem in margin. Yeah, that looks much better. And then that is all for these classes. Then we're gonna create our cross class, which we are not gonna see right away. This is the class for the images for the icons in our grid when we are gonna be clicking them. So we're gonna be using these classes in our JavaScript. So here we are gonna be creating a background image, set that to URL. We're gonna choose assets / cross .png, hit save, and then we're gonna copy down, Shift Alt down. We're gonna call the second one circle, not quirkle, circle, and circle. Cool. Then we are gonna be targeting both of them, cross and circle, and we are gonna say background size, and it's gonna be cover, so that each icon takes exactly the size. It covers the entirety of the square. Otherwise it would probably go a bit bigger depending on the size of the image by default. So starting to look pretty good. Let's see, this is a bit smaller than the project we're working on because we haven't added our media queries, which is gonna make this more mobile responsive. Let's add the start button and the text, and then we're gonna work on making this responsive. So back in our index file, we can close our info div, we can close our grid div, and under our grid, we are gonna create a new ID. We are gonna call it instructions. And inside here, we're gonna create an H2. We are gonna give that an ID of instructions __ text. Gonna hit save. And we are gonna add the by default text. Click the button to start. There we have that. Under the H2, we are gonna create a button. It is gonna have an ID of instructions __ btn for button. And inside the button, we're gonna write start game. Nice. Then under the instructions, we are gonna create the modal or modal. I don't know how you say that, but basically the thing that pops up when we click the button. So this is the modal. The way we're gonna do it is we're gonna create it first, and then we're gonna hide it by default, and we're only gonna show it when we click the start game button. So under our instructions div, we're gonna create a new div using hashtag, and naming it modal. Inside this modal, we're gonna create a new ID, modal underscore underscore content. And inside of here, we're gonna create an H2. We're gonna say enter player name. We're gonna save. So it's okay that it's showing up as it is now. We are gonna hide it in a moment. The next thing is we need a form here. And inside here, we're gonna give it a label for player 1. And we're gonna give that player 1. Perfect. And then here we wanna say input. Type, it's gonna be text, that is correct. In addition, it's gonna have an ID of player 1. It is also gonna have a name of player 1. It is gonna have a placeholder, the text that is inside of the box before you start typing, of player 1. There's a lot of player 1 here. And then it's gonna have a max length, oh, not camel case, max length of 6, which means that you can only add 6 characters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if I try to hit 7, it's not gonna work. You can choose whichever length you want, but this basically limits the names of the players. And the last thing we want to add here is the attribute required, which means that you cannot, like you see here, you can't start a game and not fill in these 2 input fields. Then it's going to ask you that you have to, it's required to fill it in. Rec. And only then can you start your game, because your players need names. The difference you can see here is that we don't actually have our labels here. So it's not saying player 1 over here and player 2 here, like it currently is here. This is the label. Let's see, that's the label. We're gonna hide that in a moment in our CSS because we already have our placeholder and it's a bit double up. But we don't just wanna exclude the label like this or cut it out or not write it at all, because it's important for readability for the browser, for text readers, and it's very important for accessibility. So it's best practice to leave the label, but then rather hide it using CSS if you don't want to have this double up style. Then we are gonna target the label and the input, Shift Alt down to copy it. We're gonna give the second one a player 2 name. We're just gonna change the 1s to 2s. There we go. And there we go, 2. So now we have both our fields. The last thing we are missing is our input. When we are done, it's going to be an input type, and then we're going to change it from text to submit. And then the value we're going to have here is value start game. And there is our start game button. So you see, they don't do anything yet other than showing that it's required. Let's see. Type in here, start game. It just reloads the page. That is functionality we're going to be building with our JS. But congrats so far. We have made every single element. Now we are just going to tweak it and style it. So back into our style sheet. We are gonna scroll down below the grid. We are gonna comment here, instructions. And then we are gonna target instructions. And then we're gonna display it, flex. We are gonna give it a flex direction of column. Then we are gonna align items to the center and also give it a width of 15 rem, the same as this area up here, because that's gonna look very good when we are on the desktop, because the spacing here is gonna be the same on each side. So that's why we're giving it that length. As you can see, that's how it looks now, our project. So let's get back to our page here, like so. Next thing we're going to target is instructions underscore underscore text. And we are going to give it a text align of center. We're going to give it a font size of 1 rem. And we're going to give it a color of text white. Starting to look good. Next targeting is instructions btn for button, cursor, and it's going to be a pointer, like so. We see that it turns into a pointer. It is going to have a width of 10 rem. It is going to have a padding of 0.5 rem in the top and bottom and 1 rem in the left and right. And then it's going to have a font size of 1 rem. It's going to have a border radius of 2 rem. It's going to have a background of variable. And we're going to say dark. Oops. Dash dash dark. And then it's going to have a border of border. And it's going to have a color of variable text white. Starting to look similar. The last thing we need here is to target our instructions underscore button and then active. So when we click it or we hold in the button, and what we want to do is we want to transform it and we want to translate it in the Y direction, that means vertically. And we want to just push it down slightly so it gives off that impression that it is a button. As we see here, when I hold down the button, and I see here that we are pushing the button down. So that's looking good. Obviously the modal is not, so let's get to that. Let's create a new comment here. Say modal, and target the modal. And we are first going to just display it none. So then we see that the modal is by default gone. And when we click this button, we're going to change that display to flex. I am just going to comment it out for now because we want to see what we are doing. So we're going to align items to the center. We are going to give it a position of absolute. Then it has nothing to do with the other elements on the page. And then we are going to give it a, let's see, a height of 100 view height. What we are targeting here is the outer div, the modal. And the modal content is everything that has with the form, the enter player name tag here. But the modal is more or less what we see here. It's the background. And we want the background to be shading the entire page. So that's why we're giving it a height of 100 view height. We are also going to give it a width of 100 view width. As we can see here, now it's taking the entire page, whilst our modal content is not. Continuing, we want to, let's say, justify the content. We want to justify it to the center. Actually, we need to give it a display of flex in order to see these things at all, because it's going to be interchanging between the default of display none and display flex when we click the button. Then we are going to give it a background of variable bg modal. Starting to look good. Then we're going to target the modal underscore underscore content. That is the form. Then we're going to give that as well a display of flex. We are going to give it a flex direction of column. By the way, if Flexbox is something you are not very familiar with or sure of, I have a separate video that I will link up in the corner that you can watch on that, and you can continue the video after you have become a master of Flexbox. It's a 13-minute or so long video. I'm gonna toot my own horn and say that it's quite effective in learning Flexbox. Next, we're gonna give it a justify content center and also an align items center. It is not doing anything here, so I wonder if we have a wrongly named. No. Let's see, modal content. Let's see, display flex. Is it? No, it's correctly targeting. Flex direction, column, justify content, center, align items, center. Okay, let's give it a height of 65%. Let's give it a width of 40%. Okay, that's what we were lacking. And then we're gonna give it a border radius. Actually, let's give it a background of variable bg red. And then we're gonna give it a border radius of variable, and it's gonna be a dark, solid, and 0.1 rem, as well as a border radius of 5 rem, and the text color is gonna be let's see, text white variable. What is going on here though? It is something is not being displayed correctly. I am not understanding what is the problem. It is probably because we have, but it doesn't have a border either. Okay. So first of all, it's not border radius here, it is border. That's number one. And then second of all, of course, is because we have not, this is for the desktop version. We haven't yet made the mobile version, and which is why it's showing up a bit weird now. But there's another thing, it's not being centered correctly. There's still a bug here. It's not being displayed correctly flexed. We have not targeted our form yet, that is why. Okay, so everything is good for now. Next thing is we are gonna be creating that form styling. So first off, we're gonna target the form. Then we are gonna say display the form flex as well. And the flex direction is gonna be column as well. And align items to the center. We are gonna target our label and we're gonna hide it by putting it to display none, like we talked about. And then we're gonna target our input fields, and we are gonna say that they're gonna have a margin of 1.25 rem. They're gonna have a font size of 1 rem. And they're gonna have a border radius of 2 rem. And a padding to give them a bit of inside space of 0.625 rem in the top and bottom. And 1.25 rem to the left and to the right. Looking good. Next thing is we're going to target our placeholder. So the text here, player 1, player 2, before we start typing. And then we are going to say that we want it to be font style italic, to just set it a bit more apart from the rest of the text. And the last thing we're going to target here is we're going to say input, and then we're going to say square brackets, and then we're going to say the type of input equals submit. And that means that we are only targeting the submit button inputs. And then we're going to say whenever we are active on it, we are also going to transform, and we're going to say translate, and we're also going to say in the Y direction, and we're going to say 0.125 rem, which also gives this button its own pushing animation. And then we are going to create our last section here. We're going to call that Media Queries. We're going to comment that out. And then we can say at media, we're going to say max width 1100 pixels. And then we're going to target grid. So this means whenever the screen size is less than 1100 pixels, we want these stylings to be true or applied. So we want the grid. Let's actually remove our display flex here. In our modal, we're going to uncomment this, display none, so that we can see our playing grid here. And then back in our media queries, we're going to give the grid when we are on the mobile screen a bit smaller size. So 300 pixels and height 300 pixels, which is 18.75 rem and 18.75 rem. Already looking way better. Next thing we are going to target here is the info title. We are going to make the spacing here a bit nicer by reducing the margin 0, 0, and 1 rem. Then we are going to target the body, and we are going to say align content to the center, and then the modal content. We want to text align to the center. We want to give it a height of 60%, and we want to give it a width of 80%. Last one is input, and we want to set that to 10, width to 10 rem. If I uncomment this now, let's see, or I just set display none, flex. Why is it, it is the modal here, flex. There we see. So what we were doing here is basically increasing the size of the modal. As we can see, by standard, it is too small, and on mobile, we need to increase it to fit everything. That is it for our styling. We are completely done. We have created all the elements we need, and we have styled everything as it should be. Let us hide the modal again. None. And now we can create our JavaScript code and actually make this game playable, because so far nothing is functional here. So let's open our script file. We can remove our console log here, and we are going to write DOM elements here, and we're going to comment that out using Control-K-C. Because here is where we're going to define all the squares that we're going to use individually, and we're going to define all the variables we need to play our game. So starting with square 1, we're going to give it a name of constant square 1, and we're going to say in this document find or get the element by ID name of, and let's see what we called it. What did we call square 1? we can close the modal, we can close the instructions, we can open the grid. We called it grid square 1, so let's copy that and paste it in here and save. Let's see if we have properly targeted our square. Let's try to console log square 1 and see if it shows up correctly in the console. Inspect. And we'll go to the console. We see it has console logged, and if I hover, we see that the first square is indeed showcased. So it seems like we are properly targeting and saving our square as a constant here. Now that we know that that works, we can rinse and repeat the system. So we're gonna copy this 8 times, once for every square. Let's see. Square 2, square 3, square 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and one more, 9. And then we're going to change the numbers here to match. And 9, save that. And then we're going to create another constant called const all squares equals document. And then here we're going to use another way of targeting elements that we have created. We're going to say querySelectorAll. And then we're going to select our grids, but we're going to use the class instead. So if you remember, back in our HTML, we set the same class for everyone called grid square. And we are going to use this one. And here, when you use query selector, it's important to remember to put dot first, just as you would write it in your style sheet. Or alternatively, if you were targeting a ID, you would have to put a hashtag. But this is a class, so dot. You can also actually just group them together with these other ones. And here we are targeting all of the squares together, whilst here we are targeting them individually. That's going to be useful later for various reasons. Next constant we're going to create is player 1 score, which you guessed it, is going to be this one here. Again, document, getElementById, and we are going to find the ID of that 0, which is info player score 1. Copy that. It's a good practice to copy instead of trying to write it over again, because you're gonna avoid errors and spelling mistakes. So this one we can just copy down, and we're gonna say player 2 score, document, getElementById, info player score 2. Then let's copy it down one more time. Here we're gonna change this constant to info text, and we are gonna go see what that is called in our instructions, instruction text. And we are gonna change this to that. We're gonna copy this constant down again. We're gonna call this one start game btn, and instead of instructions text, I think it was just called instructions btn. Let's check that. Instructions btn, correct. The last constant here we're going to create is the modal. We're going to say document getElementById, and we are going to say modal, because that is what we called it here. Then we are gonna write variable, and we're gonna comment out that, plural variables. And we're gonna create a new constant here called players. And this is gonna store all the information for our players so that we can use and update throughout our game. It's gonna store two things, and that is the name and the current score. So player one, and then colon. Inside of this players constant, we have an object, the yellow curly brackets. And in that object, we have a new object. So it's gonna be player one, and then it's gonna be two objects here, player two. It's actually gonna be two values, and one value is gonna hold another object. And inside of here, we're gonna say name, and let's just put it to Jack as default. And he's gonna have wins equal to 0 by default. And let's copy that down here into player 2. And player 2 is gonna have the name of Jill. Also wins 0, and we can't forget the comma here. There we go. So players, number 1 player and number 2 player, each with their name and their score. The next variables we're going to create are actual variables that we can change, because these are constants, and when we use the constant name, they are meant to not be changed, while we use the let name for things that are meant to be updated. This is to avoid making errors in your code. So let move, each game is going to start on move 1, and as we are clicking on our board, this move is going to increment. So we click once, it's going to turn to move 2. Click twice, it's going to turn to move 3, etc., etc. And that's how we know how many moves we're on and whose turn it is. Because by default, player 1 is going to start on move 1. Next, we're going to create a next player. And that's going to be players. We're targeting the previous constant we made. And we're going to say inside of players, we're going to go to player 1. And then inside of that, inside of here, which is here, we are going to go to name. And that's this part, which is equal to Jack. So by default, next player is going to be Jack, which means that Jack is the one who starts the game. Next up, we're going to create past player, because that's also going to be useful for us to keep track of our game, and we're going to be using this in the future. But we don't need to set it now, we just need to define the variable that it exists. Next up, we're going to create current image, and we're going to set it to default as cross, because next player is player 1, and we know that player 1 has the cross as his or her symbol or icon. So we are starting the current image, which we're going to use to decide which image to put on which square we click on. We're going to set that current image to cross because player 1 is always the one starting. And this is going to be updated and changed interchangeably based on which move we're on. Last variable here is going to be called player has 1, and by default it's going to be set to false. This is how we keep track of when we have 1 and when to start resetting our board. By default, no player has 1 because we haven't even started the game. Now let's get to the fun stuff. So we're going to create our square clicking functionality here. The functionality to click on each button and to add and remove the circle and their crosses. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define a function. We're going to add square click, and then we are going to have some code inside of here. We are going to target all squares that we created up here. Remember, that targets the classes of the squares. And we are going to say that for each square, we are going to say we are gonna run some code that is gonna do this. We are gonna say for each square, we want to add an event listener. And that listener is gonna be listening for a click event. So when we click on the squares, it's gonna run a new function. And it's gonna run a function called squareClick. Then we are gonna define this squareClick function. We're gonna call it function squareClick. And inside of here, we're gonna run some code. First, let's see if this works. So we're gonna call it using the this keyword. The only thing that this means is because we are calling squareClick inside of another function, addSquareClick, this is referencing the square here. So that is what this means, because squareClick is only being run inside of another function. So in order to get a hold of this square variable, then we need to use the this keyword. So this class list, and we want to add to this class list because the square means each square of the grid. And as we see here, the class list is currently grid underscore underscore square, and that's the only thing in the class list. But we want to add a class. We want to add, and then backticks, we want to add $, curly brackets. We want to add the current image. We have set the current image to cross by default. So let's check this function. We need to call the function addSquareClick, and then now addSquareClick is always looking. It's always running this function. All squares for each square, we are adding an event listener click, and then when we click, we're running this function, which adds current image, which is cross, into the class list of any square we click on. So let's see. And it works, but it doesn't show up. Let's just reload the page. We can see that it works because it's updating the class list, but the images are not showing up. I had this problem earlier when I was coding this project, and I think if we go to our class, if we go to our style sheet, we see that, yes, we have forgot to put background color. So instead, inside of the class grid square selector, it's not supposed to be background, but background color, because that makes the difference. When we now click, it allows the newly added class image to be in front of the background, whilst when we use background without the color, it is in front of it. So it works. Let's reload and go back to our script. As we can see, obviously we are just adding a bunch of crosses to the playing board, but that is a start. The next thing we are gonna add is actually, because when we see that we have somebody has 1, they've put 3 in a row, we want to not be able to continue clicking and filling the board. We want to freeze the function to be able to add our icons. So therefore, we're going to target the first function, Shift Alt down to copy it, and we're going to say remove squareClick. And that's going to be our function to remove this event listener. So it's going to be pretty similar, but instead of square add event listener, we're going to say remove event listener, and everything else is going to stay the same. So we're going to be calling this whenever we have a tie, whenever the board is filled up, or whenever somebody has 1, so that we can't like keep clicking on the board when it should actually be frozen and reloading the playing field. Another thing we are going to add inside of our squareClick function, we are going to check because now when I click on this square here and I click again, it's actually re-adding the image. So I don't want to be able to click again and change the image. I want the square to be frozen when there is a image there already. So that's a functionality we're going to add inside of this function now. So before we allow this piece of code to run, we're going to put an if statement here. And we're going to say that if this, which is square, any square that we have clicked, class list, the class list of that square, contains, contains. So if this square, for example, already contains in its class list cross, or if it already contains, let's put that here, circle. So either or, if one square contains a cross or a circle, we don't want to be running this code. And the reason that it's not running is because we have put these exclamation marks. This piece of text without the exclamation marks means that if this is true, then we're going to run the code. But because we put the exclamation marks on both of these, we're saying if this is not true, or if this is not true, then we're going to run this. As long as the class lists are empty, there's not a cross and there's not a circle in them, we're going to allow this piece of code which adds a cross or a circle. Then the last thing we're going to add here is when we've clicked the button, we want to increment our moves. We want to go from move 1 to move 2. And we're going to create a new function for that. So we're going to call that incrementMove. And then we're going to create that function right now. We're going to say incrementMove. Comment that out here for clarity. We're going to say function incrementMove. And inside of this function, we're going to say move is plus equals to 1, which is the same as saying equals its previous value plus 1. Then we are going to say if move modulus 2 is not equal to 0, which is the same as saying if move is not divisible by 2, which is the same as saying if move is not an even number, then something is going to happen. And that something is going to be that we want the next player to be player 1. Because if it's not divisible by 2, it means that we have an odd number, and that's, for example, 1. And we know that player 1 starts, and then on move 2, it would be player 2's turn. And then on move 3, it will be player 1's turn again. So all odd numbers are player 1's turn, and all even numbers are player 2's turn. So if move is an odd number, then next player is going to be equal to players, let's see, player 1 name. And then past player, which we have defined but haven't given any value to yet, that is going to be player 2's name. And we're going to be using that later. It's going to make more sense later. But basically, past player can't be next player because there are only 2 players and they're opposite terms. Furthermore, we're going to say that the current image, we're going to update the current image. So as long as the next player is player 1, it's going to be cross. And then we're also going to update this text to state whose player's turn it is. So info text is what we have defined up here, if you can remember. info text we're going to say is equal to, or actually info text inners HTML is equal to backticks and $sign and curly brackets players player one name tick s turn. So basically we are changing this text, which is the inner HTML, into whoever player's turn it is, and we're just adding the text s turn after the player's name. So that's okay for player one's information. Now we're going to copy all of this code, and we're going to go here after the curly bracket. We're going to say else and a new curly brackets, and then we're going to say next player, because if it's not an odd number, it means that it's an even number. And therefore, next player is going to be player 2, and past player is going to be player 1. And curly image is not going to be cross, but circle. And players 2 name is going to be the one's turn. So let's check our functionality so far. If we start, we see that Jill's turn is now shown up. And if I click again, Jack's turn. And now we also see that we are rotating the value of the current image. So it's working as intended. Of course, we don't have a winning. We can't check of who's winning, who's losing. Here, actually, player 1 should have won. Also, we see that the information here for their name is not updating yet, and neither is their score. This is functionality that we're going to be adding soon. But so far, we've been able to add a circle and a cross and have them be interchangeable with every player's turn. Let's reload. So X first, circle, and seems to be correct. The last thing we're going to add inside of our incrementMove function is 2 new functions that are going to check for win as well as check for tie. Because when we are incrementing our move, it means that we have started our game, and now we should be checking for every move if somebody has won or if we have filled out all the squares and resulted in a tie. So let's build these functions right away. Check for win. We're going to create a new function here called check for win. And inside of that function, we're going to add a constant. We're going to define a constant, which is going to be equal to an array. And inside of this array, we're going to have a new array. And here is where we're going to define all the lines possible that can result in wins. So if we go to our completed game, we see here that, for example, square 1, 2, and 3 result in a win because it's 3 in a row. So square 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 1, 4, 7. These are all winning lines. These are the lines we're going to be defining here when we're checking for our win. And we're going to target them using the DOM elements that we previously have created. So first winning line, let's write that correctly, square 1. Next one is square 2 and square 3. Then we're going to add a comma and shift alt down to copy. Next winning line is square 4, 5, and 6. Again, copy it down. 7, 8, and 9. And then let's save that. So now we have all our horizontal winning lines. Let's copy all of them down, and let's create the vertical winning lines. So square 1 and then 4. Oops, that was wrong. 1, 4, and then 7. And then we're going to start to the next line on 2. And then 5 is correct. And then 8. And then the third line starts on 3 and goes to 6 and 9. And then we have 2 extra winning lines that are the ones going in across. So the first one is going to be square 1, followed by square 5, and then square 9. 1, 5, 9. Next one is going to be 3, and square 5 in the middle, 5, and square 7. And that is all our winning possible lines, totaling 8 possibilities. Now we are going to create a for of loop that is going to iterate through this line. It's going to iterate through each line and check if there is a winning line currently on our game board. So for const align, we're creating a new constant that is taking the value of each line of the const lines that we've previously created. So for one line, for example, the first one, of lines, which is the whole array, we want to run a piece of code. And inside here, we're going to create a new constant called hasCross. And we're going to say equals to. What we want to check here is if one line returns true or false. And with this functionality, we can decide if it is a winning line or not. So const hasCross, we want to define as a line where every square inside of that line is gonna return square class list which contains a cross. That means that when a line returns a hasCross which is equal to true, then all of this has to equate to true. And what does that mean? Well, on one line, every square in that line is returning this square class list that contains cross. And if it does, then hasCross returns true, and then we're going to use that to decide that player 1 has won. But we're not done there. We want to also check if constant hasCircle exists. And for every line, we want to check every square, and we want to say that the square class list contains circle. If it does, hasCircle is gonna return true, and then we know that player 2 has won the round. So what do we do with this for loop? Well, if hasCross or hasCircle returns true, then we want this piece of code to run. Then we're going to declare a winner. And that winner we're going to choose by asking, is hasCross true? That's what this means. Is hasCross true? Which means that player 1 has won. Player 1 is winning, to put it that way. So that's what we're asking here. hasCross true. Then we're going to put player 1. Then we're going to say that the winner is players 1. If it's not true, if hasCross returns false, it means that hasCircle is true. Then we're going to say that the winner is player 2. And we're going to give the winner, which we've already defined, either to be player 1 or player 2. We're going to target the winner, and we're going to go into their wins. Because we see here that player 1, they both have a name, but they also have a wins. So we're going to target the winner's wins, and then we're going to increment it by 1. So going from 0 to 1, for example. Then we are going to update, we're going to call a new function here called update scores. And we're going to call a secondary function called player1. Oops, player1. Why does it do that? Player1. There we go. And lastly, we're going to return if either player has won. So now that one player has won, we are going to update our score and then call our player 1. What is going to happen? Because so far nothing is happening. It's kind of all in the backdrop. We know that player wins has incremented, but it's not going to show up anywhere yet. So if we play the game now, we can see that, well, player 1 has won here, but nothing is happening. It's just happening in the backdrop. So that's what these two functions are gonna say. So let's create these two next functions. They're small. So function update scores. Then we're gonna target the player 1 score, inner HTML. And we're gonna put it to equal player 1 wins. And we're just gonna copy this down. Player 2 score, inner HTML, which is these. We're gonna put to the player 2 wins. And the next function, that's everything we need for this function. So when one player has won, we are incrementing its wins, and then we are updating the scoreboard with that value. The next function, player 1, we are gonna target the info text, and we're gonna say the inner HTML of that text, and we're gonna say backtick, $, curly brackets. We're gonna say past player, because, oops, past player. We are targeting past player here because if you remember in our incrementMove, we are setting the past player based on which turn it is. So it is so that whoever wins is gonna be the past player, because when we win, we actually go over to the next round. It's paused there, but the round is still incremented, and it is turned over to the next player, which means that the past player is our winner. So we're gonna say past player 1. And then we're also gonna update the player has won variable. Player has won, and we're gonna say that it's true. This is gonna come in handy later on. And then we're gonna call a new function called continue game. So you might be wondering, why are we calling all these functions inside of other functions? It is to break up our logic into smaller bite-sized pieces, because in this way it is easier to see which function does what, instead of kind of putting everything inside of much bigger functions, and you kind of lose track of what is doing, which piece of code is doing what. So that's why we're doing this very modular. It's a lot of smaller functions like these, but that add up to a bigger functionality and overall creates the whole game. So I don't think we can still check if it is working, because we have called our checkForTie function here, and we need to make that first. So let's create it now. CheckForTie. And we're going to create that function, check for tie. Here we are also going to define our new constant called squares, where we are simply going through each square, 1, 2, 9, 9, oops, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, spelling mistake there, 7, 8, and 9. 9 with capital N. And what we're going to do with these squares is we're going to call all, we're going to create a new constant called all squares filled, because that's essentially what a tie is. All squares are filled, but nobody has 1. So constant all squares filled equals when the squares, when every single one of them, of these squares, when they return a square class list contains of cross or square class list contains, you might be seeing where this is going, circle. So if constant all squares filled, it checks all of these squares, and if every single square, this is going to be square, if every single square inside of squares, that means all of these, if all of them return either a cross or a circle in their class list, it means, well, then it means that all of them are filled. And then all squares filled equates to true. What do we want to do with that? Well, if all squares filled and player has not 1. Remember, here we put player has 1 because it is possible that the player wins on the last possible move, like on the 9th move. So then all the squares would be filled, but one player has also 1. And we want to be able to differentiate. We don't want to be calling a tie and the win at the same time. So that's what we're checking here. If all squares are filled, but a player has not 1, which we are checking with the exclamation mark, then we are going to call this text. Or we're going to run this text. Inner HTML for the info text equals it's a tie. Exclamation mark and also capital E. And then we are going to call continue game function. Now we are calling this here twice. We haven't made it yet, but we're going to make it next. After a little break in the recording, I noticed that we have a mistake here. So if we start our game with addSquareClick, because we need to have that, we haven't made our start game function for the button. And if we start playing, we see that the lines are showing up correctly. Great, but now player 1 should have won, but nothing is happening, and we can continue the game, and we get it's a tie, but yeah, nothing is happening. So our checkForWin function is actually, it has a mistake, and I saw that we actually added, or I added by mistake, these brackets here, these curly brackets. They're not supposed to be there, and neither are these semicolons after the circle and after the cross. So if we remove those, it should be working now. We want to run this whole piece of code inside of the blue brackets here as one line. And we weren't doing that with these curly brackets. We were actually splitting it up. So that was causing the checkForWin function to not work as intended. So let's try again now. Okay, let's save. And let's see if we get a win. Once player X. Yeah, okay, Jack won. Perfectly. Okay, it's not reloading. We haven't gotten to that point yet, but we are getting our win, and then we're getting more points as we clicking, which is all fine. This is now working as intended, so perfect. Let's delete the addSquareClick, and let's create a new comment here. This is where we're going to write our continue, our restart, and our reset functions. So starting with our function, continue game. Continue game is the function we use to go over once one player has won or it's a tie to reset the game board. Inside of the continue game function, we're going to call our removeSquareClick function to freeze our game board. Then we are going to add a setTimout because we want to give the players enough time to read and to see the new changes, read who won or that if it's a tie, before we kind of reload everything and we continue on to a new match. So therefore we want to have a little timeout here, and we're gonna create an arrow function, and inside of that arrow function we are calling a reset function, which we are also going to create. But for now, we are just calling this reset function after 2000 milliseconds. Then let's create our reset function. So function reset. And inside of this reset, we want to target all squares. And then we want to say that for each square, we are gonna run an arrow function, and we are gonna say square class list equals grid underscore, not grace, grid underscore underscore square. There we go. Save that. And then under there, we are also gonna add our square click because we removed it here and then we waited 2000 or 2 seconds, and then we're adding it back once we have reset the game board. Then we can also finally say that now player has won is false again. And we are going to change our info text by going into its inner HTML. We're going to write backticks, $, curly brackets, and we're going to target next player turn to start. In addition to continue game though, we are gonna need another function that is called restart game, because we want to be able to restart the game with a delay and also without a delay. So this one is just going to be a copy of this. Let's see. Exact thing, but without the set timeout. We're just going to remove that part and save. Because this one we're going to use when we initially start the game. We don't want to be delaying people or stopping people from clicking on the board when we start the game for the first time. We only want to do that in between rounds. Then we are going to create our final function, which is going to be the start game function. So we're going to write function start game, and then we are going to target the start game button. We're going to add an event listener, and it is going to listen for a click to the button, of course. Here we are going to create a new arrow function. We're going to say inside of here, we want to target the modal, we want to target the style property, the display, and we want to say that instead of the default display none, we want to display flex. Then under here, we want to create a new constant for the form element. We actually want to just create a DOM element from this form, and we are going to query selector it, and we are going to say form, and then under here we're going to use that form. We're going to add a event listener as well, but here we're not going to listen to a click, we're going to listen to a submit. And that is when we have, I'm in the final version now, when we have written our names, like so, and then we click submit, that is what we are listening to here. So back into our version, we are listening for a submit, then we are gonna target the event, the submit event, and then we're gonna say that when we have a submit event, we wanna prevent default behavior, which would be things like reloading the page. So we're just stopping that with this line here. And then we are creating a new constant, player1 input, and we are getting a hold of the value that we are writing in here. We want to get a hold of that value and save it. So that's what we're doing here. We're going to target the document getElementById, and we are going to target our, let's open up our index file I had closed here. We are going to target, if we go down to the modal, this one, the ID player1. So let's write that here, player1. Then we want to press dot value of that, and then we want to trim it, which is an inbuilt JavaScript function that basically removes any space. Like for example here, if I say Joe and then I add a bunch of space, that's going to trim that space on either side of the name. And then we want to write dot to lowercase. And another inbuilt function that is basically just putting the whole thing to lowercase. So even if I were to write everything in uppercase, it would make it a lowercase value and save it here. So let's save that. Go back to our version. Let's copy this whole code and put it down here. We're going to change that to player2 input and also player2 here. And change this. I don't know why I changed to area value max, but we're going to change that back to value. And same here, value. And then under here, we are going to write new constant, player1 input cap for capitalized, because now we're going to take this lowercase value and we're just going to capitalize it. So we're going to take the value we already made. We are going to select the character using char at, and we're going to select the 0 index, which is the first character. And we're going to say to uppercase, and then we're going to say plus that first uppercase character plus the rest of the name. by selecting player 1 input, slice off only the first, or start from the first letter. We are gonna copy this code as well, Shift Alt down. We're gonna say player 2 input cap, player 2 input here, and player 2 input here. Then we are gonna move down, and now we're gonna save these inputs. We're gonna save them in our, let's see, in our object here. So we're gonna replace Jack and Jill with the names that are given. So the way we do that, we go to players, player 1, name, and we're gonna say that now this is player 1 input cap. And then we're gonna just copy paste this down. Player 2 name, player 2 input cap. In addition to that, we are also gonna say that the next player is now player 1 input cap, because these two things are saved independently. Now let's move down and let's target our actual text here. Going to document, getElementById, and we are gonna target these. Let's see what they were called again. Info player 1 or player name 1. So we're gonna put that in there, and we're gonna say the inner HTML of that equals players player 1 name, which we have just recently saved. Same thing, copy that once more, switch it to player 2, player 2. Then we are gonna update as well players player 1 wins equals 0, because in case we have already ran a game, when we restart a new game, we want to just put it back to 0. So both player 1 and player 2 wins is now 0, and then we are gonna call our update scores function that we made up here, that is actually setting the inner HTML. And then we want to go to the info text, and we want to say inner HTML equals backtick $ curly brackets players player 1 name turn to start, because player 1 is always going to be the one to start initially. Then we are going to go to the modal style display, and once we have, remember, this is everything that is going to run once we click, let's see, once we click the submit. So once we click submit, all of this is going to run. So we also want to finally close the modal and get back to our playing board. And that's what we're doing here. So we're going to set it to none. Finally, we are going to target the start game button. And instead of saying start game, we're going to go to the inner HTML, and we're going to change that to restart game, which is a nice little touch. And then we are going to add square-click finally inside of this function. And then we are also going to add restart game, because we want to not have any waiting time. So we are calling this function, and we are basically resetting the board immediately. Finally, let's call our start game function, because otherwise nothing would run yet. Let's save and let us test the game. So can I click it? No, I'm trying to click the buttons. I'm getting the direction that I need to click the button to start. Okay, that is working. Let's see, let's call it Peter, and let's see, cap. Start game, it works. The names are updated. Peter's turn to start, great, that is the correct player one person. Cap's turn, it's changing correctly. Peter's turn, great, okay, looking good so far. Now, Peter should be winning when I click here. Peter won, great. And it reset, and it correctly made Cap's turn to start appear. And it is also the person starting. So it looks to be correct. Let's try to make this end up in a, let's see, in a tie. Oops. I unintentionally won again. Let's see. Let's make it a tie like so. I think like that should end up in a tie. It's a tie. And correctly, nobody won. Nobody got any points. What happens if somebody wins after a tie? The points continue to go up. It looks like our game is working as intended. It is also mobile responsive. If we drag it, it's gonna update because we have used Flexbox. Let's see, let's put it in a full screen. Pretty cool, and we can continue to play in a full screen. Let's see what happens if we restart. Peter 2, Cap 2 for simplicity. We see that the names have been updated, they're capitalized. Score is reset. Let's see. Cap 1, perfect. Let's restart and add a bit of blank space, Pete, and then blank space. And it's still just Pete. Great. That is all for our game. We've successfully made our game. Now let's deploy it so we can put it on our portfolio. So back in our VS Code, let's full screen it. We're just going to save. Make sure to save all the documents. Let's see, save that. Then we're going to open our GitHub Desktop and we are going to save. We are going to write what we did in the code, finished project as an example, and then we are going to push to our GitHub account. So now we are basically saving our local files up to our GitHub storage. Now we are ready to deploy using Netlify. If you don't already have a Netlify account, go to netlify.com and you're just gonna sign up here. You sign up with your GitHub account. Then when you've signed in, it's gonna look a bit like this. These are already the sites I have deployed. We are gonna press this Add New Site button. We're gonna import an existing project. We are gonna connect to our GitHub account. It's gonna ask you for permission from GitHub. You're gonna go through that and give it all the permissions it's asking for. Then it's gonna be authorized, and here you're gonna be able to see your GitHub repos. Here we are gonna search for our game. I'm just gonna write Tic, and it's showing up as the last one here, Tic Tac Toe Game. Then we are gonna keep everything as default, and we are gonna click the Deploy Site button. This website is quite simple, so it's gonna take just a couple of seconds. This yellow is gonna turn into green. There we go. We have already gotten like a default URL. If we click that, it opens up our game. We can start, we can play here. Let's just write some random names. And as we can see, the game works. It updates the score. It is available for anybody to visit. Now, a last detail here. Let's just go to our site settings, and we are going to go to domain management, and we are going to click options here, and we're going to edit our site name. And here you can give your deployed site whatever name you want. It's going to have the .netlify.app at the end. My cool Tic Tac Toe Game. Now it's a bit easier to share and for people to access that game. Click that now, and now that's the updated URL. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Give this video a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. If you're interested in creating a portfolio to showcase your project, I have a video suggestion for you right here. Until the next video, have a great one.